In the 19 years since 9/11, at least 37 million people have been displaced from their homes because of the United States wars. That's according to a new report from Brown University's Costs of War project. That 37 million person figure is more than any conflict since 1900, with the exception of World War II. American University anthropology professor David Vine is the lead author on that report. He's also the author of the book, The United States of War, A Global History of America's Endless Conflicts, from Columbus to the Islamic State. Professor Vine, welcome. Great to have you with us. So 37 million people pushed from their homes. That is almost the entire population of California. But of course, that is just a conservative estimate. What could the real total be, and where did all of those people go?
We wanted to make sure that we were as conservative as possible to not do a disservice to the people who were displaced and to avoid any sense that we were exaggerating the figures. So we were conservative in all our estimations and our methodology as a whole. The total figure could, though, reach 59 million people, which actually would be comparable to the scale of displacement during World War II. The vast majority of people actually stayed in neighboring countries in the Middle East. Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon have received really unprecedented numbers of refugees crossing their borders. Germany and other parts of Europe received very large numbers of people as well, hundreds of thousands. Upwards of 300,000 refugees have arrived in the United States from the Middle East in particular since the attacks of 9/11, 19 years ago today. But relatively speaking, very few people have ended up in the United States. The United States is really, in contrast to after the war in Vietnam, for example, when upwards of 800,000 Vietnamese, Lao, and Cambodians refugees arrived in the United States. In comparison, very few people have been able to enter the United States as refugees from the war zones where U.S. troops have been fighting.
And so for all of these people, all of these refugees who've been displaced, talk to us about what they are dealing with. How are they surviving?
They're surviving, of course, as best they can under a diverse set of conditions. Some, we saw this week in Lesbos, Greece, 13,000 people living in a refugee camp, the majority of them Syrians, Iraqis, Afghans, burned out of their refugee camp, now living on the side of roads and in a cemetery, apparently, in really very difficult conditions, to say the least. And this is not uncommon. People living in very poor conditions throughout Greece, trapped in Greece, effectively trying to get to Germany and other parts of Europe. Elsewhere, people have found a range of conditions, obviously a fair amount of discrimination, racism, in some countries, of course, assault, imprisonment. Of course, in other countries, there has been a tremendous welcome for refugees in particular, although it's important to point out that just taking our minimum, very conservative estimate of 37 million, that 8 million of those 37 million are refugees. The rest of the 29 million are internally displaced people, so people displaced within the 8 countries where the United States has fought its most violent conflicts since 2001.
Well, let's delve into that a little bit, because as you write, your report raises questions of who bears responsibility for repairing the damage inflicted on those displaced. How would you answer that question? And what could the U.S. be doing to repair some of that damage?
It's a great and important question, I think. First, we are not saying that the United States is solely or single-handedly responsible for displacing 37 million people, let alone 59 million. There are clearly others responsible, other combatants, other governments, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, U.S. allies like Britain, have all played a role in these terrible wars, some of which the United States launched, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq, others that the United States joined and escalated, Libya, and Syria, and others where the United States has played a very significant role, Somalia, Yemen, the Philippines. But what the United States should do, I alluded to how after the war in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, the United States allowed hundreds of thousands, close to 1 million Southeast Asian refugees into the United States. And similar stories were seen across the 1980s, upwards of 300,000 Soviet Jews allowed into the United States as effectively as refugees, more than 300,000 Cubans allowed into the United States in the 1960s and 70s and into the 1980s. My belief is the United States really needs to, first of all, reckon with the damage that it has inflicted through its wars, the damage in terms of displacement, but then, of course, the damage in terms of hundreds of thousands of people dead, tens of millions injured in these war zones. So it needs to reckon with the total damage and then begin to repair. And live up to a responsibility that I think we've seen in past decades, in past years, the United States has better lived up to. And that would begin with admitting, in my estimation, a minimum of 250,000 refugees per year for the next decade, 250,000 refugees per year for the next decade, as well as boosting support for refugees and internally displaced people where they are outside the United States. In addition to improving the support for refugees once they arrive here in the United States, they're given very little support for about 90 days, and that's about it. This is, in my mind, as a U.S. taxpayer, as the grandchild of refugees who fled Nazi Germany, I think something that I personally am ashamed of first of all, the wars that the United States has been waging, but the response and the lack of assistance and humanitarian care provided for displaced people who've been so grievously, I think, harmed by these wars.
Well, Professor David Vine, we thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insight with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.